Okay.
So good afternoon. As most of you know, this is the fourth seminar within the series devoted to early modern metaphors of knowledge, which is organized by the Department of Comenius Studies and Early Modern Intellectual History. The department is based at the Institute of Philosophy, Czech Academy of Sciences in Prague. This seminar series is a sort of parallel project to preparation of a volume for the Brill publishers and also the preparation of a conference which will hopefully take place in Prague this September, in the first week of September. So I hope to meet most of you at the conference in Prague as well. But we decided to do this seminar to discuss in some detail the texts which we already have for the volume, and this is a good opportunity. As usually, we will have first two speakers, Tristan Spillmann and Stefano Gulizia. And each of the presentations will take approximately 20 minutes, and the discussion to both papers will follow afterwards. Of course, you can use yellow or orange hands when you would like to discuss or write your message into the chat. I will do my best to follow these various signs, and I am very much looking forward to both presentations and to the discussion as well. Our first speaker today is Tristan Spillmann from the University of Cologne. Tristan studied English and American studies and history at the University of Wuppertal. He continued studying European history with a focus on medieval and early modern period. Starting with 2019, he works within a Graduiertenkolleg at the University of Cologne, and he is preparing his doctoral dissertation focusing on intellectual biography of Lorenzo Valla. And Lorenzo Valla is of course a topic of his presentation today as well. The title of that presentation is A War of Words Between Light and Dark, or Truth and Falsity, Lorenzo Valla's Radical Theory of Knowledge and His Use of Metaphors. Welcome, Tristan, floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I will just see to start my presentation. Yeah. Hope you see everything. Yeah, thank you very much for this introduction. In my paper, I attempt to illustrate how the famous Italian humanist Lorenzo Valla applied a certain set of military metaphors to promote his intellectual endeavor as a new and distinctive erudition. Humanism is to be understood as a cultural code consisting of different practices, as well as a social group founded in the 14th century by Francesco Petrarca and Coluccio Salutati, which gained large influence throughout Europe during the 15th century. In his two major works, the linguistic study De Elegantiis Linguae Latinae, could translate it as On Refinements of the Latin Language, and his philosophical work, the Repastinatio Dialecticae et Philosophiae, the reploughing of dialectics and philosophy, usually called dialectical disputations, Valla lays the foundations of a new semiotic system based on classical usage, as well as of a new science of speaking, both intertwined as a novel method to reshape the intellectual discourses and the disciplines as such. All of his writings were deliberately challenging the contemporary paradigms and the language of scholasticism, addressing its methods as well as the social status of its members. Valla believed to have identified an ongoing decline in the usage of Latin in the past 600 years that resulted not only in a complete disintegration of education and the arts and sciences, but also led to tangible consequences such as legal misconceptions, philosophical confusion, and theological disorder. Since all intellectual endeavors and discourses were continuously expressed in Latin, Valla intended to return to the language of the best authors of antiquity, configured by an index of Latinity, that is, the ideal oratorical expression. As one could suspect, by the time of his major publications, many of his fellow humanists rejected the works in which Valla criticized the basics of Latin learning in medieval schools and universities. His contemporaries warned him of subverting the established order of knowledge and doctrine, often labeled as sapientia or doctrina veterum, and even compared his ambitions to a revolt within the Republic of Letters, that is, of a conventional understanding of scholarship and its authors. Comparing Valla's ambitions to a violent attempt to overthrow the order of the intellectual field was compatible with his project and the way he described his efforts. Language, as the primary subject of his work, was evidently not only a vehicle of communication, but rather an instrument to establish and maintain an imperial government in an intellectual sense, that is, taking control of any discourse. In the first preface to the Elegantiae, he compares the military rise of the Roman Empire with the simultaneous diffusion of the Latin language, the lingua latina, which he identifies as the Roman language, the lingua romana. Speaking Latin, based on classical usage, was equivalent to speaking Roman, therefore fashioning oneself as a citizen of a virtual Roman Empire. Whereas the political empire ceased to exist due to historical circumstances, its language remained among the different peoples in all over Europe, even though in a decline which he wished to reverse. As he points out, Latin has eventually been conquered by the Gauls and Goths, and these terms do not denote the actual historical peoples, but instead the scholastic and legal thought associated with France and Germany. These intellectual fields are labeled as foreign invaders, alluding to their rising influence in Italy in the Latin late Middle Ages. Valla suggests that one must imitate Camillus, the so-called second founder of Rome, who supposedly fought off the Gauls at the beginning of the 4th century BC. If this historical analogy is taken literally, the indoctrination of barbaric thought and language can only be stopped by re-establishing classical usage in its entirety. The Elegantiae laid the groundwork for this endeavor, as Valla tells us, and above that, offer an ideological frame for humanism, now fully equated with classical Latinity. He firmly proclaims that the Roman Empire is there, namely, wherever the Roman language reigns. Speaking Latin, that is, the Roman language meant to take a hegemonic stance in all intellectual fields. The dualism between scholasticism and humanism, ideally spoken and simplified here, of course, is constituted by the humanist's actual application of classical Latin in contrast to the artificial and barbaric language of the scholastics. Whereas the Elegantiae lay the foundation for a new semiotic system, the dialectical disputations formulate a new theory of knowledge and a corresponding method for any scientific inquiry, largely based on Quintilian's Institutio Oratoria. Valla proposed a reduction of some of the basic principles laid out in the Aristotelian organon, which served as primary foundation of the academic disciplines. In the process, he subordinated dialectics to rhetoric and offered a new logic that he pretentiously labeled as Logica Laurentiana. Consequently, he identified Aristotle and his modern followers as the primary target of his writing. In this presentation, I want to focus solely on the dualism between humanism and scholasticism, promoted by Valla as an intellectual war between two languages, classical Latin and barbaric Latin, between truth and falsity, and finally between light and dark. All these metaphorical contrasts are applied by Valla to establish humanism as an alternative approach to intellectual endeavors, as well as to unify the humanistic members as a social group. Let us now take a closer look at the dialectical disputations. The prefaces share the same ideological foundation that we find in the Elegantiae. The whole work is mostly concerned with Aristotle and Boethius. As primary authorities of scholasticism, Valla also uses them as a synecdoche for the modern peripatetics, that is, the scholastics who allegedly follow their master Aristotle blindly without allowing anyone to criticize their claim. According to Valla, the scholastics are ignorant of both Greek and the Latin language. They distinguish themselves through a technical, artificial, and hence unclassical idiom, and cause malpractice across all academic disciplines in the process. Valla outlines his program by showing how rhetoric is supposed to be the science of all sciences, whereas dialectics is subordinated to the rhetorical inventio, as another argumentative strategy. The image of war is thoroughly used to contrast the two different forms of erudition. The aim of his dialectical disputations, he says, is to save all potential students of his work from the traps and deception of the sophists who have forged new words to destroy their opponents by renouncing the customary speech of the ancients. Valla operates with a variety of metaphors relating to the semantic fields of military terms. In this way, he creates a martial context in which two parties fight each other with trickery and deception to vanquish the other. Consequently, deriving the notions from Quintilian as well as Cicero, Valla defines the orator as the warrior or soldier serving under the emperor of truth, who is supposed to face the peripatetics in public debate. He says the following: "We are not enemies, namely, when we debate with each other, like those who actually fight. We serve as soldiers under the emperor who is truth. Hence, whoever objects to a speaker of truth, he abandons his emperor and joins the enemy, leaving camps of wisdom and moving to shrubs of ignorance, so that darkness may overtake whatever light is in himself, and malice deprives him of virtue, and death kills life." Again, we find an imperial metaphor. The emperor is now identified as truth, veritas, while the deserters join the enemy, only implied through ignorance as the opposition of truth, which is, of course, falsity. We find an antagonistic view of any debate where ambiguities, if we believe Valla, do not exist. Debaters who do not share the view of truth, what truth is and how it is determined is explicitly not mentioned, are denoted as defectors from truth, further expressed by the metaphorical dualism of light and darkness, virtue and vice, and ultimately life and death. They emphasize the stakes of the alleged contest, contest. That is, the categories in which participants of the debate have to regard their role in context. Interestingly, Valla does not define truth any further in the prefaces, and his actual treatment of veritas within the dialectical disputations is rather short and partially equivocal at best. However, in the preface, we can assume that Valla intentionally left the determination ambitious and used it as a headword, which applied in philosophical, juridical, as well as theological discourses likewise. Since he also intended his works to contribute to theology in general, veritas can nevertheless stand for the Christian truth as well. We will return to this matter shortly. Truth, he tells us, has to be the victor in any debate and points to the purpose of his writing. Certainly, he says, who are no members of their sect or school have been given arms by me, with which they can not only fight off the enemies of truth, or rather the defectors, but also drive them out from anywhere, capture them and put them in chains. It is their practice, namely, not ours, to kill the ones who are defeated and who are not able to truly defeat, and instead rather want them killed than captured. His dialectical disputations are to be understood as weapons for anyone who does not belong to the Aristotelian school. The defectors of truth are unable to take prisoners with their arguments. Instead, they kill their opponents, which can probably be perceived as silencing them either through a premature end of the debate or, if we want to believe Valla, through a social exclusion of the opponent. Taking the opponent as prisoner can be read as not convincing arguments alongside the metaphors defeat and capture as winning over through conclusive arguments. Summing up, Valla skillfully outlined an ideological program that must be viewed in contrast to the established scholastic scholarship found at the universities of the late Middle Ages. His use of military metaphors is used to differentiate between two paradigms that he depicts as expressions of true and false learning, attacking the very foundations of medieval thought in general. The prefaces of his major works are an important key to understand his linguistic program that is far more than an intellectual discourse. One can say that he outlines a cultural project that aims at re-establishing ancient practices in all fields of learning, enunciated in classical usage. Valla radicalized the intellectual discourse with his contributions and drew the line between true and false branches of scholarship, between humanism and scholasticism, dividing the academic fields by creating an image of warfare and two parties. His claim, however, that Latin would construct an intellectual dominion enunciated with the verb reign, dominari, did not remain unchallenged. The famous humanist and apostolic secretary Poggio Bracciolini not only objected to the term lingua romana, which, according to him, would rather denote the Italian vernacular. He also attacked Valla's habit of criticizing established authorities and his subversive attempts to modify the traditional intellectual world. Eventually, he reproved him for his notion of Latin as an instrument to take control over people. Who as ever, you most impudent beast, said that? Where did one hear that the Roman language reigns? People do reign, a language does not, emphasizing that Latin is not an instrument of power, but one of advantage, a cosmopolitan medium equally used by all of its speakers. Following these accusations, Valla defended himself in his first antidote and justified his use of tropes with references to the works of Cicero and Quintilian, explaining that lingua romana does correspondingly stand for the Roman people who propagated the Latin language and therefore exercise concrete political as well as cultural power, ultimately deploying the Roman majesty, majestas Romanorum, across the globe. As we have seen, the Roman people are not the average Roman citizens of contemporary Rome, but in fact orators that need to be trained by his dialectical disputations. There was not one humanism in the middle of the 15th century, but several different humanisms. Valla reinforced his interpretation of the intellectual movement with a strong set of military metaphors to mark his own position and projects, whereas Bracciolini accepted a coexistence between scholasticism and humanism and defended the traditional disciplines as essential parts of the intellectual world. Valla intended to subordinate all arts and sciences under the dominance of Latin purism, that is, of the Roman language as an own system of thought and knowledge. I hope I could give you a short overview of my paper, and I say thank you, gratias vobis ago.
Thank you so much for your paper and for your analysis of the way Valla used rhetoric of military conflict or warship between the two parties. And of course, we will return to your paper afterwards in the discussion. Thank you once again. Our second speaker today is Stefano Gulizia. Stefano is nowadays based at the Department of History, State University of Milan, as a affiliated lecturer. But before, he worked at several universities and research centers, including University of Minnesota. He spent more than a year, I believe, in Warsaw at the Jagiellonian University, before that at the University of Bucharest. And before that, he taught for, I believe, 6 or 7 years at the City University of New York. Stefano is an intellectual historian specializing in the early modern period, with a focus especially on scholarly networks, print culture, themes connected also increasingly to the astronomical networks and discussions around astronomy. Stefano was trained originally as a classicist in Italy before moving to the United States and focusing more on history of knowledge, history of science. Okay, I should mention as well that Stefano is the editor-in-chief of the Scienziae Studies series at the Amsterdam University Press, and one of the key members of the committee which organizes yearly conferences called Scienziae and devoted to the disciplines of knowing in the early modern period. Today, well, sorry, I didn't mention some of Stefano's publications. Just to mention some of the topics of his recent journal articles, as I mentioned, these include his interest in networks of astronomical observatio, for example, in early modern Europe, disputing the animation of the heavens in Rome around 1616, the philosophy of mathematics and other topics. And also Stefano is preparing, maybe I'm wrong, maybe some of these volumes have appeared in the meantime, but there were 3 major projects recently, book projects. One is the collective volume, The Wisdom of Automata, which is edited by Stefano. And there are 2 volumes authored by Stefano. One is Galileo's Knowledge Communities in 17th century Padua, and the other one is devoted to Northern Aristotelianism Nikolaus André Granius, and the scientific networks at Helmstedt. Okay, I hope I introduced Stefano at least a little bit. Stefano, floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you. You've been way too generous with this introduction. It makes me shameful for what I have to say and the time I have at my disposal. So hopefully you didn't raise too much of an expectation for this particular paper. I am very pleased to see you, Vladimir, and the Comenius Institute. I thank you for the invitation. I also thank my friend Tomasz from Olomouc, who has been with me for so many years. And I am very happy to bring the Scientia conference to Prague soon enough, you know, with Vladimir and Tomasz and many others, including Eva Lelkova, who will join the conference committee. So hopefully that will be another moment to gather, for us to be together. As far as this particular paper, you saw it was long, and I apologize for inflicting upon you a larger amount to read. I hope some of you have read it, because I do not feel I have the strength and the energy to go through most of that in a few minutes, but it is there. As you saw, I did not use a Brill style of citation, so I wanted to really have a bibliography separated for the moment, and then as you know, Brill doesn't like that and will be incorporated in the footnotes. But I hope you find the bibliography at the end of the paper at least as useful an orientation as I find it for myself at this stage of the process. I also should say that I do not intend to publish all of this paper in our common proceedings. I think some of which would inevitably be cut, probably by a ratio of 30%, or maybe 40%, it depends. But I wanted to use the opportunity of this particular meeting to give you a larger overview of what I'm thinking about, why, and perhaps some of these things, materials, you'll find it redundant, and some maybe are not. But in general, what I wanted to do was to look at Kepler and Kepler science from the point of view of subaltern technology. And by that, I mean particularly the artisanal workshop in the Holy Roman Empire, and something that definitely originates with Nuremberg, with Dürer, Nuremberg, all the way through the crisis and the epitomizes the turn of the century, 17th century. And the reason for that is because I was interested in cycles of non-knowledge that accompanies a cycle of knowledge. I was interested in a deeper permanence, in a sense of loyalty and cohesiveness that I found in the letters of Kepler from the period, which is the period that I'm looking at, which goes between the publication of the Mysterium Cosmographicum in 1596 up until the later publication of the Tabulae Rudolfine, which were published in the city of Ulm in 1627. However, they do belong to the Prague period. And it was just delayed as a publication because of wartime, and also because of the complexity of adapting a computational keyword to make sense of the vast databases of astronomical transit that Kepler inherited from Tycho Brahe when Tycho moved to Prague and was established there in 1601. So my goal was to try to look at a period, defend the cohesiveness of a period in Kepler's production, which is largely based in Prague. And now the sources of this period are largely in Stuttgart. I became very interested in the annotated editions of the Tabulae Rudolfine, which are preserved in Stuttgart, and they contain a lot of artisanal information, which I hope I give you a couple of examples in the process. Within this, so the paper, what I do and I explain in the first section of the paper is that I try to see the Tychonic inheritance of Kepler basically as an episode in the vulnerability of research resources. So almost like an environmental problem, a larger problem that has to do with the natural sustainability and issues of regeneration, alchemical life and mineralogy, and also the bureaucratic rationality associated with mining, German mining. I argue in the paper, these are crucial points of view in this particular period. So there are many ways to defend the unity, the epistemic unity of these works. And one of them is definitely to look at in terms as a problem of network. Kepler is loyal to the same people in this time, talks to the same people, never cuts ties with the community of astrologers, with Lutheran priests, with a number of folk herbalists to whom also belonged his mother, his own mother. And it was remarkable to me to see how this response to the crisis, which was confessional, was theological, but also epistemological, created in him a sense of loyalty, a sense of unity over time. So that inspired me in turn to look at it and sort of defend the trajectory that goes from the Mysterium Cosmographicum to the treatise that he wrote in 1611, De Nives Exangula, which is a fabulous essay in morphology and complex approaches complex forms of biology. And I see that as a kind of termination of this course. So I see a trajectory in the Mysterium Cosmographicum, as you saw in section 4. There is a debut of the Polyhedral Thesis, the idea that you can use layered ontology and constructivism to describe the distance between planetary movements, and so constructed as a nested system of solids, which is a very courtly gesture. It was done by the turning at the lathe, also through woodcuts. There are many artisanal dimensions of that layered ontology that came into place. And then eventually what I try to explain throughout the paper in the second half of the paper, particularly between section 5, 6, and 8, I mean 5 to 8, is that the morphology of the letter or essay on the snow, to me, embodies some of the same principles of morphology and taxonomy, and also the mathematical ethos that I found already at the inception of this period, which would be at the Mysterium Cosmographicum. So ultimately, I guess one of the reasons that spurred me to do this is to attempt a demonstration that, a kind of demonstration that while mathematics and mathesis as a metaphor and as a tool is normally seen as a Neoplatonic inheritance, so it's considered as part of Kepler's Platonism, I see that there's a major usefulness in keeping this separate. And I argue extensively in the paper for those who, suffered through it. I argue extensively that there's a quantity of unexpected and substantial non-Platonic material in Kepler. And so to me, I would resist throughout the idea that even in the case of the explanation of the six-cornered snowflake, we need to resist the idea of looking into that in the proclivity toward the geometrical disposition of Neoplatonic mathematization. There are other things going on there. And so part of my paper is to explain that there is a reason and a usefulness to keeping geometry separated from its ontological content. And for those who are interested in this particular aspect of the paper, you'll find that at the very end on page 28, I make a comparison between my argument and an argument that was advanced in about 10 years ago by a French scholar, Raphael Andro, in the case of Stensen, of Nicolaus Steno. And so even there, mathematization or mathesis becomes a geometrical order that precedes and neutralizes a harder epistemical commitment. And so in my view as well, in Kepler science, I refuse the reductionism of mathematical figures in terms of Neoplatonic lore. So I'm trying to go, and I'm sorry, this is a hopeless attempt to draw some kind of conclusion from this sort of data deluge. I'm placing Kepler in a data deluge after Tycho, but I suffer from my own sense of lack of continuitas in this particular time. So section 2 talks about mathesis as a metaphor. I realized I should have said more about how Kepler came to view artisanal communities as indispensable in his work. And so let me just try to do that in a minute. The main point of departure is the contra ursum. Kepler was hired to work in Tycho Brahe's observatory, the research center in Prague, primarily as a philologist and as a lawyer. So his main task was to defend Tycho against Ursus, who advanced claim of priority in certain cosmological issues. And there is a letter which I stupidly didn't use in the paper, what I will use certainly in the final version, in which we see Kepler really identifying a level in which artisans and German artisans working in contemporary workshops understand astronomical hypothesis as a metaphor of knowledge. And he says very clearly, these are notes, these are preparatory notes to the Contra Ursum, which is a few years before the treatise on the snow, but it is a few years after the Mysterium Cosmographicum, in which Kepler says, this is how an artisan views a cosmological arrangement. And how it views it, from what I understand from the context, is really seeing as a mechanical object. And so because of that, Kepler decides from that moment onward to defend Copernican theory and heliocentrism from the point of view of the artisanal workshop. This is remarkable, is very little known. It is also very little known that Kepler at the time had something that we would consider today a confidentiality agreement, which bound him to the Swiss instrument maker that many of you probably know, Jost Burgi, who also came to Prague in successive trips, and eventually Rudolf II gave him a job, and actually a pretty well-paid job, presumably the second or the third highest paying job at the court at that time. Burgi was developing a computational system based on logarithms, which allowed Kepler to actually use the tables, the astronomical tables, which we inherited from Tycho. So this was a crucial element. Unfortunately, this discovery is very recent and is only, I mean, it's just been discussed in German bibliography, so it's not very well known. But there are a lot of sources that detail this particular arrangement. So Burgi and Kepler had an arrangement similar to the same that bound the master of Kepler in the early years, which would be Brahe himself to him as a lawyer, as a philologist. And so it's interesting to me to look at these documents because there is this kind of, as I tried to say, a longue durée of artisanal metaphors in this period. And if we see some of the annotated editions of the Tabulae Rudolfine that are now preserved in Stuttgart, there are at least a couple. There is one, for example, in which an artisan draws in the back of the tabular page of the printed edition. He draws a number of triangles and basically develops almost a reduction. It's essentially an application to geometry, very, very simple application. There's nothing new theoretically there, but it's interesting to see this as a kind of response from a mixed science. So this is not astronomical per se. It's just an artisan trying to make sense of that from the perspective of his land surveying and geometrical sort of day-to-day life. And another example of that is a Lutheran pastor in the city of Ulm, and his name, if I remember correctly, is Wolfgang Buchmayer, not very well known. This is a Lutheran pastor about 30 years younger than Kepler, and he also annotates the Tabulae Rudolfine, and he boasts that he manages to observe a solar eclipse in 1629, and then he writes about it in a letter to Kepler, and he says that he was able to do it because he applied the method. And interestingly enough, in his account of the situation in this letter, you have astrology and theology going together and basically validating one another, which is, to me, it triggers the idea that really Kepler was responding, was aware of this development. And so part of his work was to appease, to respond to this particular communities. So very briefly, I'm not going to go into any detail, sorry about that, but in section 3 of the paper, tantalizing as it is, I try to criticize a model of courtly patronage which was advanced by the great scholar of Tycho Brahe, Christiansen. Christiansen, as you know, is a Danish-American scholar who wrote probably the most compelling, most the best book on the journey of Tycho's institute when he, after the crisis of patronage and the king cuts the funds, and so he has to find a way to Central Europe. So I tried to summarize my ideas on that with a map, which I produced with the Palladio software with the University of Stanford, not particularly user-friendly. I think the map is frankly not very good, but you can see, as I argue in a part of the paper where the map appears, let's see what page is that, it's page 8 on the paper. You see that the Institute travels across a series of cities, starting in Copenhagen, Rostock, and then eventually Wittenberg, and coming into Prague. And my contention in this part of the paper is that Tycho's caravan of books and instruments effectively retraces the substantial path that is commonly associated with the Protestant academic marketplace. So my criticism of Christensen is that while he sees that episode as a crisis of big science, and effectively, in fact, explicitly, he constructs Tycho Brahe as an Einstein of the 17th century, who eventually finds himself in need of a great patron. So, for example, the United States saving Einstein research from Nazi Germany and importing the whole thing into the United States. Effectively, I argue, perhaps too long, but I mean, extensively, I try to argue that this doesn't make sense, that there are conditions in the Holy Roman Empire that have to do with a certain understanding of courtly culture, courtly patronage, of the presence of artisans and workshops that really make Kepler's inheritance of Tycho special and unique to the place. And so, as I said at the beginning, to me, this is largely almost an environmental point of view into the problem of courtly patronage. So I'm afraid I can't say more, and I'm sure I don't sound very persuasive, but if you read the paper, hopefully you can say I'm right or wrong. But anyway, there's a lot more to say to that in section 3. Can I ask, how am I doing on time? Do I have like 5 minutes or 6 or 8, or I just don't want to take too much time, and I'm not aware of let's say,
I believe you have still some 6 to 7 minutes.
Okay. So in section 4 of the paper, I begin the sort of major transition that takes from the Mysterium Cosmographicum to the treatise on the snow. And certainly, there would be a lot to say on the particular diagram, the very famous illustration of the Mysterium Cosmographicum, which is known as the Tabula 3. And I try to discuss that in section 4. And I try to discuss it from the point of view of the use of polyhedric objects, such as they circulated in Germany. So if you're interested, you can read that particular. So it's a particular angle on the Mysterium, not a usual one. And there's a discussion of very recent scholarship that have appeared on that. And then subsequently, I introduced a character in the Imperial Court of Prague, and this is the German Chancellor Wachenfels, who is a very interesting figure. I use him for various reasons. I use him because he's, in my opinion, the epitome of Homo Ludens. He's also an enthusiast of Giordano Bruno, so he's an atomist. He's interested in Epicurean astronomy. And largely, because the Kepler's essay on the snow is dedicated to him, one of the interpretive keys of my paper is that I see the essay as a response to Wachenfels and his circle of, let's say, atomist enthusiasts and Brunian enthusiasts. So the idea is that Kepler writes an essay to prove them wrong, to really take a stance which is against the atomistic theory, but at the same time incorporates some aspects of the formative faculty. He speaks extensively in the essay of a facultas formatrix, which is probably taken from a Galenic context, but it makes Kepler makes this idea do something very, very different from what his friends were accustomed to think in those terms. So I have a very brief introduction on this character, and then I go into the, I guess, the heart of the final part of the argument, which is really about a reading of the treatise on the snow. That I do that in two parts. The first part is a close reading of a particular passage that struck me because it had Stoic references, because it had something to do with the classical quotation that was extensively annotated by Kepler and eventually made its way into the largest gloss, the printed gloss. That has no parallel in the work. But the section of the paper I'm most interested is definitely what is currently section 8. There I have, I guess, a larger view. I try to summarize the argument of this book, and I talk about morphogenesis, I talk about taxonomy, and I also refer throughout the paper to the Alexandrian tradition, particularly exemplified by Archimedes' Descent Reckoner, which was a book that determined a numerical upper bound for the grains of sand that fit into the universe. And so it's a good example of this fascination, Hellenistic fascination with huge numbers and use of myriads qua myriads. And so if I can just say one more thing about what I try to do, is it will be this, that I try to read Kepler treatise on the snow through the lenses of Reviel-Netz's work on epistemology. And Reviel-Netz, as some of you know, is one of the most important readers of Alexandrian mathematics and Hellenistic theory of mathematics. And he has a very good book that talks about ludic proof, the idea that there is a new sense of proof in Hellenistic time, which becomes prominent in geometry, that has to do with the ability to impress and to astonish. So this becomes, I argue, a sort of an alternative to the Aristotelian idea of the potissima demonstratio. So there's something else going on in the treatise. Kepler references some more common books, for example, Scaliger and Cardano, and there are other more, I guess, normal references. But he also has this background in Hellenistic theory. And so I was interested to dig that and try to bring it up as much as possible. So if you're interested in that part of my project, section 8 is probably the best way to understand what I try to say about the playfulness. So the idea that there is this the jokes of nature, jokes of knowledge, metaphors in general, are not limited to a kind of fuzzy or strange monstrosity of nature or geological oddities and so on, but it really has an epistemological dimension. And so the snow, reading the snowflake, reading the honeybees and other complex forms, the pomegranate in the 1611 essay, is really a way to characterize Kepler through the lenses of Hellenistic playfulness and their idea of mathematics and Mathesis as playfulness. Well, I'm sorry if this was too much for me. I did my best, but thank you anyway.
Thank you, Stefano, so much, both for your written paper and for your presentation, for summarizing the main ideas of your paper, which is, of course, enormously rich and inspirative. And I would like to open the discussion, your questions, your comments. So please, if I may start, perhaps to break the ice, I would like to ask Tristan first about you focused in your paper quite understandably on these military metaphors, and you nicely described the dualism used by Valla in his very rich use of these military metaphors and the differences from his opponents. But you also mentioned the agricultural metaphors, and I would like to ask about them, whether these agricultural metaphors like repastinatio and other metaphors were just common and were similar to the metaphors used in this sense by Valla's opponents, or whether he also used these metaphors in a more original way, and whether there is also some kind of dualism in the usage of agricultural metaphors. So, thanks.
Thanks for the question. The agricultural metaphors are not so much used, if I think about it now, in Valla's work, and by the other humanists only partially. Those speaking of Latin as a fruit and so on is pretty much only used in the Elegantiae and partially in the first version of the Repastinatio. And other than that, not really. So this was really outstanding, as I've acknowledged it, that because it doesn't actually fit to the overall context. So there is something special about this use, because as you may know, humanists, they use their words for special purposes. So if they use a special word, you only find in certain ancient authors, there must be something special about the context.
Okay, thank you. I can't see anybody raising orange hand or writing into a chat. So I will use an opportunity and ask Stefano as well. Well, your paper indeed is extremely rich in various themes and various focuses. And I was trying to think about our main focus, the main focus of our series, of course, and of our conference, and this is early modern metaphors of knowledge. And I hope I will not disinterpret you, but just an attempt to summarize somehow my thoughts about what you presented in your paper. I hope, I believe that geometrical forms you are discussing in your papers may be interpreted as a special kind of visual metaphors, which had their own aesthetic functions, which had their own moment of playfulness, as you nicely described in the paper, and which had a very special appeal on various communities of readers, such as mathematicians, but also noble patrons, artisans, etc., etc. And at the same time, these images functioned as a tool of knowledge, as a sort of, they had an epistemological function based on various intellectual practices and also on various traditions. And these images were very deeply rooted in broader contexts, which you call cultural geography. Okay, so now if we think of a snowflake as a kind of such a metaphor, now, of course, snowflake can function as a metaphor for cosmic harmony, for example, of mathematical order, etc., etc. But I'm just interested whether this was the way how the readers understood Kepler's treatise, whether they understood snowflake as a metaphor, as such. Okay, this is one question. Then there is a question you mentioned several times, of course, Kepler's connection, and this is a great topic, to artisanal world, to artisans, and how artisans understood cosmological models as metaphors as well. I am interested to what extent Kepler himself used artisanal imaginary in his works or metaphors related to artisans and the workshops, etc. And perhaps the third remark, it's not that much a question, but remark, there is this beautiful passage where you discuss in your paper Christianson and his way, his interpretation of Tycho, and of course the way he used a metaphor of a great whale. You know, Tycho as a great whale, or his scholarly enterprise as a great whale, and you point out to some, 17th century or 16th century even imagery related to a great whale. So I'm just, and even you link this metaphor to Tycho Brahe's to his own self-fashioning. Mm-hmm. Of course, he didn't use probably this metaphor himself, but can you comment just a little bit more on this metaphor, or on how it was used? I know that you discuss it in the context, in the eschatological context, for example, as a natural wonder, a sign of impending doom, etc., etc. Yeah. That there is this fascinating connection between how this word is used in the historiographical context, mm-hmm, as a metaphor, and how it was used in the 16th and 17th century. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you. This is all great. First of all, I should say that I make no claim that what I try to do is successful. I mean, I am aware that the complexity that I try to tease out in a certain number of pages is doomed to fail. So, I mean, at some level, there's going to have to be some, rewriting and more. But I do think that as you said, geometrical forms are definitely related to optics. I ignore Kepler's optics just in terms of space, but it is true that he participated in a culture of Kunstkammer plays and demonstrations. So we have fairly well-known accounts of him going into these shows, courtly, fashionable shows, and getting ideas in the Camera Obscura and then reworking them in some of his own work. So in a sense, there is a view that when you ask me how readers understood the snow, there is a sense in which a chancellor like Wacker von Wachenfels would have probably seen the snow as a joke, because the snow is an immaterial piece. It's you're walking on Charles Bridge, and he pretends to have this intuition into the fabric of this hexagonal fabric of the shape. But the snow, of the three main pieces in the essay that he talks about, the pomegranate, the snow, and the honeybee, the snow is the least productive in terms of, it doesn't have a philosophical tradition. The honeybees really do. I mean, Aristotle talks about bees in the Generazione Animalium 310, 38. There's also Roman readers who talk about bees, Georgics, of course, Virgil, and also Cicero. So in a sense, the honeycomb as an object of study, I think it's one part of Kepler's essay where he does something a lot more traditional. But the snowflake is really new, because so he introduces the object itself as almost it says nothing, right? There is this perpetual game on nix in Latin being almost synonymous with nothing, and so there is an extended, elaborated play that goes on among his readers, and I think he was aware of, it was part of a gesture. However, I do maintain that there is a limit to this. I mean, you can see this going on, but at a certain level, Kepler, he's interested in a different mathematical interpretation. So he does not want, for example, to validate what he sees as a Platonist. I mean, he sees Epicurean atomism as a threat to the, specifically a threat to the congenitas, to the beauty of the world. And so he does not want void, he does not want shapes. And actually, the only people who discuss the kind of filling space pyramids or filling space shapes were people who were interested in precisely this tradition. So you have, for example, Thomas Harriot, who writes letters to Kepler, does not mention the snow, but he mentions the piling of cannonballs on the ship. Harriot talks about this to Kepler, and he says, I made experiments, mathematical experiments, how many cannonballs can be fit in a triangle so that the ship can carry them, you know, for a military campaign. So this was a very practical exercise in England, and it influenced Kepler's thinking. But Kepler, I mean, Harriot, sorry, was an atomist. He was thoroughly Epicurean. And so Kepler adapts these themes in a frame that I think is decidedly, at least in my interpretation, is decidedly anti-Epicurean. And so the snow is a good object because it's beautiful, it's natural, it is a part of it's a meteorological object, if you will. But it works against this tradition of filling space polyhedra that have been, you know, by his friends in Prague and also by his correspondents, such as Harriot, interpreted as a Epicurean object. So ultimately, the whale, why did I use it? Well, first of all, because Christensen used it, and Christensen is the one who writes that Tycho is self-fashioning as a kind of bigger than life. You know, his science needs money, lots of money. He needs lots of instruments, needs lots of artisans, lots of people need to go to Hven. And when, you know, that is no longer possible, what happens to it? And Christensen has this stigma, I think, against bourgeois Central European environments. He sees them as kind of, you know, essentially, it's inconceivable for him that something like Tychonic science would prosper in an environment like Dresden, like Prague, like Wittenberg or Rostock. But actually, I think Kepler had a different view, and I think that his view is more similar to the observations of natural phenomena, including whales, but also comets and other things, which are really, I think, in my what I know, they're rooted in Aristotelian exercises of sort of making observatio and then using this material in a sort of very, very loose environmental way, because the meteorology of Aristotle is the lowest of all the sciences. Which is why in the famous scene of Hamlet, you know, you have this, you know, the prince looking at the clouds and say, does it look like a whale? And the other says, yes, very much like a whale. So you have this kind of vignette of meteorology. And I thought of what Kepler was telling us that happened to him in Charles Bridge, you know, that the snow was falling on him. It's very much a reenactment of this scene of meteorological observation. And I think he uses cleverly, not only because it's good, is a good literary technique, but also because as a metaphor, he's telling some people, some friends, you're wrong, this is Aristotelian, this is Stoic, this is about something else. You shouldn't read Lucretius, you're too much into Giordano Bruno, so look at my snowflake. That's the some that I tried to say.
Okay, thank you. I see no chat, no yellow hand yet. Yes, there is one. Iva Velkova.
Hi, Stefano. Thank you very much for your extremely rich and interesting paper.
Thanks.
I actually don't know what to ask first, but I would have a question to your final argument about the Hellenistic theory present in Kepler's work. And I would have a question, how much this is actually a kind of discourse usual to his contemporaries, and to how much there is some kind of unique reading or understanding Kepler may had into original sources? Or did you actually observe this kind of argument or theory in works of his contemporaries?
That's a great question. Actually, so the Sand Reckoner, which is this book by Archimedes, which is specific, is one of the very few specific citations that you find in the Nives Hexangula. So I thought it was striking because it gives you very little, remarkably little. Everything is indirectly present. But in this case, as well in the case of Cardano and a few other things, you really have the book there. And I thought, what is it doing? Why is it there? And in addition, there's also the Collectio by Pappus, which is another of these works that belong to the larger Hellenistic theory of mathematics. Now, how many of these books were read at the time? I think not too many. Galileo himself was trained in the larger Archimedean tradition, but he does not use the Sand Reckoner. He uses a different kind of Archimedean mechanics, which is a little simpler, and it doesn't have this sort of interest in the quantity is quantity, in the myriads of number, in the astonishment, is a different theory. Interestingly enough, when Kepler sends some of his works down to Italy, hoping to get some kind of peer review, he wants Magini to read it, he wants Galileo to read it, he uses the Pinelli circle as a funnel to get some of his works down. Nobody picks up on the Archimedean Hellenistic dimension. And that's a very erudite circle, as you know. I mean, very, very accomplished. They have access to many printed sources in Venice, out of Venice. They were Hellenistic in nature, especially commentaries to Aristotle, to works of mathematicians, people like Ettore Ausonio, for example, who is very innovative in the field of optics and so on. But nobody picks that particular element out. And so I was, that gave me the opportunity to think, this is really something that Kepler wants to, it's a way of self-fashioning himself. Essentially, he's doing something that, even to the extent that at that time, in 1606 or 1607, or even earlier, someone like Galileo would have committed himself to some form or another of heliocentrism, but they would not pick up on this Hellenistic theory of demonstration, the idea that you can have a proof that is essentially ludic, that is playful. And so I think Kepler capitalized on that, and he made much out of it. And even when he received the Siderius Nuncius and he wrote a dissertation on it, he used irony all the time. So I think he identified himself with the idea that as a theoretician, he was the one who pioneered a rediscovery of certain works that actually put a premium on not only being funny, but also to astonish the readers and instruct them through the use of multiplicity, multiple dimension. So you have the science fiction of the Somnium. You have various sort of literary tricks that Kepler uses. So I don't know if it's a sufficient answer to your query, but it is it is unique. It is flagged by Kepler, and it doesn't, at least as far as his Italian and German correspondence that I've seen in these years. Well, I haven't read everything, of course, but as far as the major lines of communication in these years, there seems to be only his take on this particular Archimedean sub field of Hellenistic theory.
Thank you very much. I think this is really interesting. As you know, I think that Athanasius Kircher actually used this.
Yes, indeed.
So Kepler, if you see Kepler as pioneer of this kind of science, and
then you have a genealogy. Yes, that's
it would be definitely interesting to dive into it even more and really see whether there is some continuity or not.
No, you're right. No, that's great. The letters of Kircher in Tuscany, I mean, to Tuscany rather, you know, from Rome to Leopoldo, others in the 60s and so on. They do mention a lot of Archimedes because at that point, the Cimento Academy was in the process of translating works like, for example, the Conics of Apollonius of Perga. This was a major enterprise for the Medici. It was, you know, they put a lot of people onto it, and they had to know Arabic because it was so it was a very complicated situation. Kircher was one of the people who was really sort of looking into how much of this Hellenistic works, you know, came out, and Kircher was interested in the spectacularization of the idea that you can use, as you know, you can use demonstration is no longer a syllogistic, enterprise, but it becomes theatrical. So I think that, but you have to go a little further. I mean, in terms of Italian sources, you have to go after the mid-century to find people who really were conversant with this tradition. Before, I don't think Galileo's people knew this, but then after in the Cimento and those yes, it was all there, and largely thanks to people like Kircher and and the Orientalist from Germany, and it was a very collective enterprise to get back at those late Alexandrian sources.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you so much. Any other questions or comments to both of our speakers today? I do apologize to Eva. It was actually, your question was in chat, but I haven't seen it. Sorry. Don't hesitate to ask either about Valla or about Kepler or anything else related to the topic, and of course, to our main topic, to metaphors of knowledge.
Perhaps if I may add a few words.
Of course.
Concerning this snowflake at Kepler, we should not forget that Kepler explicitly explains it, that Wacker of Wackenfels admired Giordano Bruno, while Tycho refused Brunian philosophy, and Tycho spoke about Bruno as Nolanus, nothingness, and this is why Kepler started his treatise that for sure Wackenfels will like this treatise about snow, about nothingness, because he likes this. But also there is interesting military metaphor, very important in Kepler's work, and it is in his Astronomia Nova, which he presents as a war against the god of war. And this was several years ago studied in a PhD thesis of one Australian scholar named Dorsey, who argued that this Kepler's metaphor was actually intended to attract attention of contemporaries to the scientific arguments. So this rhetorics of Kepler was actually for practical reasons, because he wanted to claim his thoughts which were not commonly accepted. So he wanted also to present them in a way which will be remarkable for the readers. The same can be found in Kepler's Somnium, where also he uses comparison with demons, speaks about demons and so on.
Yeah, thank you. Excellent.
Thank you, Peter.
Yeah, you're right. I should have mentioned the. You're right about the fact that nothing is a key to the handling of Giordano Bruno. I was distracted by the fact that there is this poem. I don't know if you know the poem by Jean Passerat, which is also about nothing, and it's there is a reference to that because. Well, in the preliminary part of the Nive Sexangula, but you're right. I mean, for my argument, what you just said is crucial, and I should incorporate it because it's true. And I think it also shows the inheritance of a particular discourse in which Giordano Bruno's infinitism is a challenge, precisely because it posits an idea of proliferation of worlds, which is not conducive to order and stability and so on. As for the military metaphors, it's true. I didn't compare the Astronomia Nova, but there is one part of the Nive Sexangula, only one page, where there is the image of the military metaphor for the bees, I think. And so I suspected when I read that it was taken from either a Roman context, because of the bees are a symbol of proficiency in well, economic sense, getting things in a certain way. And this could also be a hint to Aristotle, because Aristotle describes the fact that you have a division of labor, so you have the workers and the kings, and it's so he likes that, he marvels at that, and he thinks so I'm not sure, but you're right that this is I mean, it's an important comparison that I need to make, and also especially on the Bruno as nihil. Yeah, it's great. Thank you so much.
Thank you once again. Any other comments or questions to both of our speakers? Yes, Peter Pavlas.
Yes, thank you. I have just a comment, just a brief comment to Stefano's paper on Kepler. I don't know Kepler much, but I remember that he has a bold metaphor somewhere. I can not now remember which title, which writing of Kepler is that, but I think he somewhere says that natural scientists are priests of the highest God over the book of nature, which seems to me quite bold and quite symptomatic for the 17th century rise of the natural science, that Kepler uses this metaphor of natural science as a kind of priesthood, that the nature is like a Bible for for theologians. Nature is like a Bible for natural scientists, which is an analogy of the Bible for theologians. Yes, it's just a comment. If you can.
It's really interesting, isn't it? Because you expect something like that from Newton, but not in this early stage. You're right. The question for me would be how to make what to make of Melanchthon in Kepler, no? Because really, my paper is not very good on this. It's not about that, but. The idea is really that there is a way to see Kepler as coming back to that particular image of, it's not priesthood, but it is heavily Lutheran and theological, in the sense that you do have, this doctrine of light, you have the rehabilitation of Aristotelian astrology in the context of the Wittenberg curricula. So it's so I was working on this paper. It made me think of how much of that spirit is continuing in Kepler, even though of course Melanchthon didn't want to become a Copernican, but I mean but there is that, so I think it's an interesting. So your quote goes, in the future, in the kind of those authors who look at, but also back, in terms of what is this priest of nature. Is that a concept, that has a story in Lutheran circles? I believe it does, but I'm not the right person to. But it's an intriguing question. It's in the background of all this, yes, because it's true when you look at a pomegranate or snow, it's this kind of meditation becomes, it's about taxonomy. It is also about this, as you said, reading the book of nature in a very, ethical, theological way. I guess it's an open question, but
of course, it was just a comment that it is not so much associated with the metaphorics which you described, but it just came to my mind. Thank you.
Thank you. So any other questions, comments, remarks? I have actually one more question for Tristan. I mean, Valla was extremely influential figure within the whole humanist movement, and his dialectical disputations were equally influential. And I'm just curious whether you followed also the influence of his rhetoric, the way how he used his military metaphors, to what extent they were later imitated or even copied, because of course there is the whole genre of humanist polemic. So to what extent this particular military discourse served as a model for the following generations of humanists, and perhaps a related question, for how long, if it served, as I suspect it served, for how long, when exactly this influence, or this Valla as a model for using military metaphors in polemical writings, when it disappeared as a influential model?
Yeah, that's a very interesting question, because on one hand, Valla was considered as well, how to say, as the most polemical writer, and many people had problems with him, not so the younger generation that really imitated him, but the older one, like Poggio Bracciolini, they didn't like him at all. They said he was too radical, and his polemical style was really a problem within the humanist movement. But afterwards, especially the military images that were also used by Cicero and Quintilian, but firstly, redeployed by Valla, actually. For instance, we have Angelo Poliziano at the end of the 15th century. He used a lot of these metaphors. Erasmus of Rotterdam, of course, he was a huge Valla. He was really influenced by Valla, and he published even some of his works. And of course, for the Reformation. Then we have fully this set of metaphors in all directions, and there has to be a lot of work to be done because Valla influenced the Reformation a lot. Ulrich von Hutten, for instance, read Valla and published also works of him. And of course, Valla did not know what would become of his writings. So of course he would have never probably accepted the Reformation, but his thought was used extensively within the Reformation by Martin Luther, Melanchthon, and all the other writers. And then I think in the middle of the 16th century, then Valla ceased to be imitated. It's really around 100 years when Valla was influential. Leibniz is the next one who works with his writings on free will. And then there's barely anything until the late 18th century. Then Italian scholars rediscover him and write biography. The first biography, the first modern biography, so to say, is published at the end of the 18th century about Valla. So until then, he's not read anymore, except for his Eleganti, because this is a work for Latin, for schools, and it was used as a handbook until the very end of the 18th century when the modern philology really developed. So until now, people used his Latin handbook, and that's it. The name Valla disappeared for now then, for the time being.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you. So once again, I'm asking whether there are other questions or comments. It seems there are not. Okay, so if this is true, so thank you once again for both presentations, for both papers. Thank you so much. Thanks to all of the listeners and those who discussed. Of course, we will continue. We are in the middle of our seminar series, so we will have 2 more meetings, I believe. I cannot find now the program in my papers here, but as far as I remember, well, we will have next time, we will have Jacques Joseph with his presentation on Henry Moore and the metaphor of light. And we will have a paper on Fontenelle by a colleague from Brno, Ms. Pichova. And then the very last meeting, which is already the first week of June, there will be two papers, one on Comenius' Labyrinth of the World and his use of metaphors, and the other one on the way pietists used metaphors in their writings. So I apologize, I do not have a program in my hand, but you will all receive it once again. And So you are all welcome to join us for the next meetings as well. So thanks again and have a good evening. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.